think it's really important to consider our treatment of refugees as such, because in a way that's it's a trial for how we're going to treat much larger groups of displaced people in the coming years. And then finally, I think we should be very careful about making climate refugees into a group of deserving refugees, and other refugees, say fleeing war, persecution, etc., as being less important or less severe because they are not connected to climate change. And as you saw in the video clip, the responsibility that industrial countries share for climate change seems to give rise to a responsibility to help climate refugees, but not other refugees. And I think that's a really dangerous way to start differentiating people. And I think we should avoid that tendency. But it's going to be a big challenge for us, and I think we need to think not only legally and politically, but also morally, and how we should respond to climate refugees.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Faber. I'm director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. We work at the state, national, and international levels looking at both the causes and solutions to environmental justices. I'm also a research fellow with a new organization, the Global Center for Climate Justice, based here in Boston. And I'm on the board of Coming Clean, which is an organization made up of 300 of the leading environmental organizations in the United States, such as Greenpeace, NRDC, Environmental Justice Health Alliance. And we help to make strategy on behalf of the movement as a whole, looking at what are developing a strategic vision and having organizations work in unison and coordinating with one another around this larger vision. So as an academic, I have sort of one foot in the movement and another foot in the ivory tower, so to speak. And what I would like to speak with you tonight is about what I see as a climate refugee crisis that's taking place in the world economy. And much of my start, actually, I got interested in this topic in my work with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We were looking at the impacts of climate change in the Pacific Islands. So I was traveling in the Pacific Islands. I've been to Fiji and American Samoa, and we were looking at issues of saltwater intrusion and the destruction of freshwater lands and the displacement of peoples throughout the Pacific Islands, particularly in the low-lying atolls. And what could the U.S. government do, particularly the CDC, to protect the health and facilitate either the restoration and protection of these cultures or seeking their resettlement? And, you know, one of the big questions we were dealing with around this when I was watching your presentation was, you know, one of the big questions is, do refugees that relocate from the Pacific Islands, do they seek assimilation into the cultures that they're being relocated, or do they seek to preserve their own unique culture and be relocated in such a way that they could maintain their traditional way of life and their own political institutions? That's another issue that is not quite worked out yet around the climate refugee crisis. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the larger framework by which we can situate the climate refugee crisis in the world today. I've done some work on this with a colleague, Christina Schlegel, and she is the executive director of the Global Center for Climate Justice. So some of this is her work. We just put this together about 40 minutes ago. All right, so go on. And so what I would like to do is situate the global climate crisis in the larger political economic context, which is the advent of neoliberal capitalism and globalization, and put forth this notion that how we situate the climate refugee crisis is very important, that it does not take place in abstraction from the larger political economic forces at work in these societies, and that it's a mistake to look at climate refugees outside the larger political economic context in which they live. So we'll go on the next slide. So one key concept I want to introduce to you right away is this notion of vulnerability. Not all people experience the same vulnerability to climate change. And there are many factors which determine one's vulnerability, including where you live, obviously, but also one's political economic power. Because if you have less resources, education, money, and income, then that makes you more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We saw in New Orleans, for example, that Lower Ninth Ward and elsewhere, that those people who lacked home insurance, who saw their houses wiped out, lacked the resources to rebuild those homes. They weren't insured. And so of the 175,000 African Americans that were displaced in New Orleans, 75,000 of them or more never returned. They were permanently displaced. So even within the United States, we could argue that we have climate refugees. And the source of that crisis was the years of neglect at the hands of the state government as well as the federal government. Actually, 3 months before that, Hurricane Katrina decimated those communities. I was having my classes read a piece in National Geographic where experts were predicting that disaster to happen. It was on the top 5 list of the federal government of likely disasters to occur. And for years, residents in those communities were making pleas to the state and federal government that they were vulnerable to this oncoming crisis and that the levees need to be reinforced and so forth, and those pleas were ignored. So for many of us, that's an example of environmental racism, the ways in which communities of color that are often most vulnerable to these hazards are ignored by policymakers. Next slide. So I want to make this point that people don't just migrate because of climate change, although I think there is a gradation, and I'm glad you did that presentation. It was really interesting because obviously in the Pacific Islands, if your island is literally being washed away by the king tides and rising sea levels, then we could argue then that climate change is the primary driver of dislocation. But in so many other societies, whether or not you become displaced by climate-related stresses has a lot to do with your power within that society, the political economic structure of that society. Is that an exploitative society? So you can have a sort of a hurricane in one nation that also impacts a neighboring nation, and in one country it's an unmitigated disaster, and in the other it's an inconvenience because of the ways in which the political economic structures in one nation serve to protect residents from the onslaught of a hurricane, while those protections are completely ignored in another. So that has everything to do with political economic power. So when you look at climate refugees, you have to look at the power relations involved in any particular nation. And so one's ability to recover and to have resiliency in the face of these climate-related stresses has everything to do with political economic power. Next slide. So obviously then, the less political economic power that a community possesses, fewer resources they have to defend themselves, the more likely they are to experience massive dislocations related to climate change. And that there are many different types of climate-related injustices. So there are socioeconomic climate-related injustices that exist within nations, where certain peoples are more vulnerable than others because of the lack of infrastructure and the lack of investment in protecting those communities, as in New Orleans. There are international-related climate injustices where nations like Kiribati and other nations in the South Pacific who contributed 0.000001% to the climate crisis are feeling the greatest impacts. And so that's considered a primary climate injustice, as you saw in the film. And that the United States, as a large carbon producer, in many ways is held as owing a carbon debt to those nations and peoples of the world that are facing such dislocation. In fact, President Obama pledged to create a $100 billion fund to help fund adaptation in such nations. I think ultimately only $30 billion went into the fund. But it was initially a priority and recognition under the Obama administration that there was this carbon debt owed to the global south. And there are intergenerational injustices. How do we connect to the impacts that future generations are going to feel and take action today that will protect future generations from the displacement and from the coming climate crisis? We'll go on the next slide. So climate change is here. It's happening now. And some of these numbers, there are many different studies, and there's contention over what some of these numbers mean, but it's seen as implicated in the deaths of some 300,000 people each year in the world, and climate change is seen as impacting about 325 million people each year in the world economy. In 2005, 20 to 25 million people were displaced by climate changes, and that particular year, I think it was more than that were displaced by war and political repression. And of course, it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish a climate refugee from those fleeing persecution and so forth. But obviously, the numbers of climate refugees are growing. Next slide. So the British government became concerned about the impacts of climate change and commissioned Sir Isaac Stern, who was a leading economist, to head up this commission looking at what are the projections of climate change looking into the future. And the predictions of the Stern Commission, official body of the British government, was that by the latter half of this century, the impacts of climate change will have a depressionary effect on the world economy. You could see the destruction of something of 1/3 of all the total value assets in the world economy. But also on the projections of a 2 to 3 foot sea level rise, they were projecting up to 200 million people around the world being displaced by climate change from sea level rise alone. Next slide. And if we look at the current refugee crisis, climate refugee crisis, current estimates range, as we saw, from 10 to 20 million a year. That I don't think that's any necessarily accurate anymore around war and persecution, but 1 of every 25 people in the world are impacted by natural disasters each year. That's about 225 million people. And the Red Cross puts out these reports every year, and I've been reading them for about 30 years. Every year they come out, and what you see is the frequency of natural disasters are increasing exponentially, and that many of these natural disasters are being fueled by climate change. So the dislocations associated with natural disasters are being magnified. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that somewhere around 150 million, while other studies predict up to 1 billion people could be displaced by 2050 by climate change. There's a new study that just came out of Cornell, some reputable scholars, and they estimate that by 2100, as much as 1/5 of the world's population, 2 billion people, could be displaced by climate change. If that isn't part of that apocalyptic model, I don't know what is. And part of this is being fueled, and I'll talk about that, how the models around climate change are being redrawn. Particularly, you're going to see this in the next 2 or 3 months. The scientific community has been much more concerned because some of their prior predictions about the pace and magnitude of climate change have proved to be grossly conservative, and that now we see that, in fact, that climate change is feeding on itself, that is accelerating, and we are quickly approaching this tipping point that unless we take immediate and dramatic action, we may pass these tipping points, at which point our ability to contain climate change may be removed. James Hansen has recently estimated, he's revised his predictions. He's the leading climatologist in the United States, if not the world. And he has predicted now a sea level rise of between 6 to 15 feet by 2100. So already with the British government, we saw an estimate of 200 million people displaced by a 1 to 3 foot sea level rise. And we now know that those estimates may be grossly conservative, underestimate the magnitude of climate change as it's coming down the pipe. Next slide. It's estimated that climate change kills about 300,000 people a year. By 2030, a mere 10 years from now, that's estimated to go up to 500,000 people per year, 500,000. And that the vast majority of these deaths are occurring in the developing world. That's not to say that climate change does not take massive life in the developed countries as well. The heat wave in 2003 in Europe killed 71,000 people, the majority of those deaths occurring in France, particularly among the elderly and those who had respiratory problems. So even in Europe, or the heat wave in Chicago in 1995 killed about 800 people. So people in the first world are also feeling these impacts. But the majority of the deaths associated with climate change are occurring in the global south because the vulnerability levels are so much higher and political economic systems are much more exploitive in many of these countries. Let me know how I'm doing on time. I have no idea. Give me a marker. Next slide, please. And so these are where you can see where the majority of the deaths that are occurring in the world economy today that are related to natural disasters. You can see the bulk of them occurring primarily in Africa. Next slide. So there have been a number of different studies, and the new study by Oxfam predicts that one person is forced from their home every 2 seconds by climate change, and that people are 7 times more likely to be internally displaced by floods, cyclones, and wildfires than volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. In other words, climate change is passing other types of natural disasters and to be a primary displacer of people around the world. Next slide. I'll come back to that because in much of the neoliberal viewpoint, which I want to talk about, this is seen as an opportunity that if you take an entrepreneurial approach to climate refugees, then that they're acting opportunistically to move to different areas of the world where they have better economic opportunity. It kind of individualizes the problem and tries to make what is in many ways a disaster into an economic opportunity. And we'll come back and talk about that point in a second. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how many of these natural disasters aren't natural, and climate, we want to be careful not to naturalize climate refugees, but really put it in this political economic context. And there's 4 points I would like to make here. One is that global neoliberal capitalism is rendering natural disasters and climate-related stresses much more frequent and severe. The second point is that global development is increasing the social and ecological impoverishment of populations around the world, which is making them more vulnerable to climate change. Third, corporate-led globalization is leading to the increased degradation and denuding of landscapes, which makes the environment much more susceptible to climate-related stresses. And fourth, that climate change is increasingly being used as a tool of social control by policymakers themselves. So I just want to kind of run through these points. First time I've ever given this talk, so it's not fresh in my head. So we'll see how it goes. But next slide, please. So one is that one of the impacts of globalization has been to facilitate the appropriation of ecological space in the global south by transnational capital, and to facilitate a process of what's called unequal ecological exchange, which is the increased appropriation of natural resources from the global south at ever cheaper prices. So there's a massive transfer of wealth, natural wealth, that is occurring in the global economy today, the extraction of increased quantities of physical natural wealth from the global south at ever lower prices. Some might refer to that as a new system of ecological imperialism. At the same time, more and more environmental harms are being displaced from the north to the global south in the form of direct foreign investment in destructive extraction processes, the relocation of dirty industries and factories from the north to the global south, countries such as China, the dumping of dangerous commodities, like a lot of pesticides that are banned in the U.S., dumped on the global south, the transfer of toxic waste out of the north to the global south. So we live in this new era of ecological imperialism, if you will, that globalization is facilitating, and it's tending to magnify the impacts of climate change. But at the top of this is the way in which the global system has failed miserably to contain carbon emissions. They continue to go up, and right now the fossil fuel industry plans to develop about $27 trillion in known fossil fuel assets. If they are fully exploited, that will take us 5 times beyond what the scientific community says is safe to burn, and we will be guaranteed to live in a world that's 9 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century than what it is now. So we could say that there's a fundamental opposition taking place between what is in the interest of the fossil fuel industry and the preservation of the planet. And I can't remember any time in American history where there's been such a political gulf, if you will, between what the scientific community says we must do and where our political leadership is at. And the footage of Trump is a perfect example of that. I don't have time to talk about that now, but in many ways we could say our American democracy has been colonized, our government has been taken over by what I call the polluter-industrial complex, particularly the fossil fuel industry. And they are working to subvert climate change policies that would serve to minimize and perhaps minimize climate change, but also launch us on a new path of green development based upon clean energy and so forth. You talked about Syria, so I don't need to. I was going to talk about the ways in which that was an example of a new type of crisis. Next slide. So CO2 levels now, this is why I guess I want to make this point because I think it's important. A lot of the science has changed very quickly, and it's new, but we are now at, that should be 415 parts per million. It just went up in the last 2 weeks. Compared to 280 parts per million at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. This is the highest levels of CO2 that we've seen in at least 800,000 years. And in fact, if we go back 3 million years ago when temperatures were 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than what they are now, the sea levels were about 50 to 80 foot higher than what they are today. Under this scenario, business as usual scenario where emissions are going up about 3%, most climatologists agree that the ice sheets of Greenland and West Antarctica will be gone. If Greenland goes, that's 20 feet to the world's ocean levels. If West Antarctica goes, that's another 20 feet. And there's some dire predictions that are coming out in terms of some of the expected sea level rise that we may see 100 to 200 years from now. So these predictions keep going up. Next slide. But what is kind of interesting, and you'll see this coming out in the papers very soon. I was doing a presentation with Gavin Schmidt at the World Meteorological Society meetings that were here in Boston. He's one of the leading climatologists, works with NASA and NOAA. And so what's happening is all the leading climatologists and the models and the institutes that exist, such as Hadley Center in Britain, are ramping up their predictions as to what climate change is doing to the global environment. So, and part of this is predicated on the notion that a lot of the feedback mechanisms that they were looking at, they didn't anticipate that they would actually serve to magnify climate change in a way that's feeding on itself. So the new studies show that cirrus clouds up in the upper atmosphere, which climate change is increasing, actually serve to also trap heat. So what we've seen, if we go on to the next slide, is that these are the new predictions that are coming out, and they're ramping up what the expected temperature increases are coming down the pipe with regard to climate change. So Canadian Center, UK Earth System, Hadley, they're now looking at 5.5 degrees Celsius temperature increases toward the end of this century. That's about 9 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these models. Next slide. So as a result of this, we keep getting warmer and warmer and warmer. 2019 was the second hottest year on record. You can see all the hottest years on record, top 10, have occurred in the 21st century. If you grew up in the 21st century, you never experienced a yearly mean average temperature that someone experienced in the 20th century. So we've entered a completely new climactic period, the Holocene, exiting the Holocene and entering the Anthropocene. This is a new climactic period. And we're on pace now to have also this year one of the hottest years on record. I think February was the first or second hottest year on record in Boston. Next slide. So second, neoliberal capitalist development is increasing social and ecological impoverishment. Globalization basically is leading to the increased displacement of people around the world. And as more and more land becomes confiscated for export production, I got like 3 minutes, 2 minutes. More and more people are moving to areas which are ecologically fragile, or they're moving to areas like floodplains or high mountains that are dangerous to live. On the next slide. So, for example, I was doing some work in El Salvador, and with the expansion of export agriculture there was a massive displacement, forced removal of a lot of small family farmers, peasants from the land, and they moved up to the steep hillsides of the volcanoes. And these hillsides were so steep that they would have to drive a stake into the hill and tie themselves to it to keep themselves from rolling down the hill. So you imagine if you clear a mountainside where the slopes are like this, and you denude it, when the rains come, you can imagine the tremendous destruction that occurs, erosion and so forth. Next slide. So as a result of that, climate change is being magnified in the sense that landscapes are becoming increasingly degraded. More and more people are living in ecologically fragile or dangerous areas. And so the health impacts or the damage that's being done to their lives is increasing. I think it's something on the order of, in the height of the displacement, 100,000 people a day were being displaced by globalization and the penetration of export agriculture and industry into the countryside of the global south. And the fourth is that climate change is often used as a tool of social control in the service of global capital and national security. So this is kind of interesting. So in this case, the U.S. government has been using the Sonora Desert as a weapon against migrants. They used a technique where they were intentionally channeling migrants into a part of the desert where their chances of survival were few, and they were trying to use death as a deterrence. And during the height of this program, there was a death of about 1 or 2 migrants a week occurring as a result of the strategy. And I think Trump has been emblematic of this strategy, putting children in cages and basically torturing a lot of immigrants into the U.S. in terms of these horrendous living conditions, under the notion that if conditions are so horrible that people will not want to come here. Next slide. So I'm running out of time, right? I mean, yeah. So I'll kind of wrap it up, but I think it's very, very important that we look at how we frame the climate refugee crisis. What kind of frame do we use? So often you see the adoption of a neoliberal framework where climate displacement represents an opportunity. It can create a labor force to fuel the growth of industry as populations are relocated from one country to another. So it's interesting reading a lot of the neoliberal discourses that try to frame climate-induced displacement as a positive feature. Next slide. Then there's the fear frame, which is that climate refugees represent a national security threat. Former Senator Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, is a big proponent of this particular view. And what you have is sort of a demonization of climate refugees, that they represent a threat to U.S. national security or the security of other nations. And that is often used as a legitimation for the inhumane treatment of migrants, as we've seen, for example, in Australia at the Nauru concentration camp there. And then the third frame is, going very quickly, next slide, is a justice frame. And that what we know is that we need to reframe climate refugees as a consequence of ecological imperialism, and that our efforts should really be built at building up the resilience and promoting equality and sustainable development within countries, within communities, so that they are able to withstand climate-related stresses. That really climate refugee crisis is about launching a new development path which is predicated on social justice, sustainable development, democratization, and using local resources to meet the needs of local people. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Unlay. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement for the City of Boston. So I will be talking a bit about how we're thinking about this issue locally. What does it mean for a municipal government when it comes to this sort of provocative term, right? Climate refugees. Slide, please. So I'm actually going to go over Boston's immigrant history briefly and talk about my office. And then I'll walk us through a couple of case studies of how the city of Boston responded to a couple of recent natural disasters. Bring up some challenges that go well beyond the local context but affect the local context. And then our thoughts, what our thinking looks like moving forward. Slide. Slide. So what this chart shows, what I'd like for us to notice is that Boston is not at peak immigrant population, nor is Massachusetts, and nor is the United States. So Boston's at top, darker orange line there. We're at 28% foreign-born as of 2015. It'll probably go up 1 or 2% in the 2020 census. But in 1910, we had 36% of our population as foreign-born. So migration and being someone who had to cross a border to live in Boston or Massachusetts or the United States is not a new concept. People move across borders to live here. That's happened for quite some time. Slide. And this interactive map shows the growth of the foreign-born population in the greater Boston area as a percentage of each of those cities and towns, right? So you can see there's a point where it's pretty dark, and then it lightens up in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's gone up again, right? So we're seeing group come in, or various immigrant groups come in as a cohort, settle, right? Smaller and smaller cohorts, and then you have larger cohorts again in the past 30-odd years. Slide. And here's a fun map that we're going to update pretty soon that the City of Boston likes to put out of the immigrant populations in our various neighborhoods. And the larger the font size, the higher proportion of the immigrant population that particular country of origin is. And so for some of these neighborhoods, if you're familiar with Boston neighborhoods, you might not be surprised at all. But even for those who are close observers of Boston's neighborhoods, you might be a little surprised. For example, the Brazilian population has gone down in Allston Brighton. The Chinese population is pretty high in West Roxbury. The Haitian population's grown pretty high in Hyde Park. Slide. So what does that mean for us as a local government, right? We're led by a mayor whose parents both came to the United States from somewhere else. They came from Ireland. They joined a community of immigrants that had been here for quite some time, but he has seen it, his experience, as a similar experience to those who continue to arrive regardless of country. And in recent years, as mayor of Boston, he has stepped forward to take various stances to support Boston's immigrant communities, that are from all over the world, right? So, the Muslim travel ban got announced on a Friday. That night, he rushed to the airport and was speaking to people who wanted to support those who were, stuck, in this sort of limbo within the airport, but not admitted to the United States. Later that year, He announced the Greater Boston Immigrant Defense Fund, which is a legal defense fund. Now in its third year. This year, it has $700,000 to fund legal services and community education for immigrants. And we just updated the Boston Trust Act this past December, right? But through his leadership, he's trying to create a social environment where the message is one of welcoming, right? However you end up here, we want to welcome you. We want you to feel welcome. Slide. So we have the office that I work for. We've been around since 1998, and we do all sorts of things, all aimed at trying to help Boston's foreign-born populations and immigrant communities more broadly speaking, which will include the children of immigrants and refugees like myself, to be fully a part of the city life, to be fully integrated, whether it mean economically, civically, socially, what have you. And so we also have various initiatives throughout the city that aim to remove barriers for folks, whether it be an access to services barrier, a cost barrier, access to information barrier. And we also want to, we have these immigrant information corners in all the libraries. We're getting ready to expand it to many YMCA locations throughout the city. But we also try to send a message through murals and storytelling, right? So we have these To Immigrants with Love murals throughout the city that try to connect Boston's immigrant past with its immigrant present by painting murals of immigrants who had lived in Boston in the 1920s with those who are prominent in those neighborhoods now. Slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about two natural disasters that happened outside of Boston that really affected Boston and how it's affecting our thinking now, right? And what our response to it was. The first is the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010, which is not a climate change issue, right? But it is a natural disaster. It did happen at one point suddenly in time. So it is informative to us. So why is the earthquake in Haiti so important to Boston in particular? Well, Haitians are the third largest immigrant community in Boston. Boston is the third largest Haitian community in the United States. In fact, something like 27,000 people speak Haitian Creole in their homes every day in Boston. Slide, please. So we have this concept, right? This professor from UCLA, Tendai Achiume, has this concept that migrants cross borders where they're not political strangers, right? So an earthquake happens somewhere else. Why are Haitians coming to Boston in particular? Well, because they have social capital in Boston. They have friends, they have family in Boston already, right? But can they get to Boston? Well, if they had a pre-existing visa already, yes. If they were already here, possibly as an international student, yes. If they were a U.S. citizen who just happened to be living in Haiti at the time, sure they can get here, right? But for so many others, they couldn't. And many others, they just tried to physically get to the United States, if they could, and make their way up to Boston. And so there's this legal barrier of immigration law preventing folks from getting here. But then you might have heard of something called TPS, Temporary Protected Status, which especially in the case of Haitians, not the Haitian community only, but of everyone in looking at the Haitian community, has been thought of as a humanitarian response by the U.S. government to help suffering people somewhere else due to something like an epidemic or civil unrest or a natural disaster. That is not what TPS is. TPS simply is a status that recognizes people who are already physically present and says that the conditions in your country of origin are too severe for us to force you back, so that we will give you some recognition of that, and therefore you can obtain some immigration status and whatever comes with that, such as a work permit, right? So what the city did is to really try to dispel rumors. We got together with the federal government, the state government, community organizations. We held a community forum. Folks had questions about adoption. We tried to clear things like that up, questions about visas, questions about TPS, which did not exist right away. And we set up a resource center in the community at a labor union, SEIU 1199, right next to UMass Boston, for a month, where people could just drop by and ask questions. And we actually hired an extra intern that semester to help staff it. And we had legal clinics as well. Slide, please. And then because there's this sort of social connection to Haiti, people in Boston also went to Haiti for relief efforts, right? Especially with healthcare, but also long-term sort of physical infrastructure assistance. And in the long term, the Haiti Fund that developed out of the Boston Foundation became the Haiti Development Institute, which has now built a school there. Slide. So the second case example is Hurricane Maria. So why do we care about Hurricane Maria if Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens? Well, Puerto Ricans have a distinct culture. They have a predominant language that is Spanish, not English. And they face a lot of the same challenges that immigrants, when coming to the mainland of the United States, face, other than immigration status, right? But they face issues of cultural issues, issues of racism, and the like. And this is a map that shows, how the Puerto Rican population is distributed in terms of residents in Boston, but also, the Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth, has a large share of the Puerto Ricans in the United States. And if Puerto Rico were a country, it would be the largest, people from Puerto Rico would be the largest immigrant community in Boston, in fact, right? Slide. And so even though, or especially because there was no legal immigration barrier to Puerto Ricans coming to Boston, after Hurricane Maria happened, Puerto Ricans did come to Boston. In fact, some came right before the hurricane. And what we had to do is we had to pull together in sort of a ad hoc fashion many state, city, and community-based organization partners to try to figure out a response. And it was messy to begin with, right? We were not fully prepared. We were very reactive when it came to this. And so we have city agencies like public health preparedness, emergency management, neighborhood development, my office, because we have so many bilingual Spanish speakers and so many folks used to helping newcomers who just arrived here from other countries. Well, you're arriving from another place, although it's within the United States, you're going to have some adjustment challenges. IBA, South Boston Acción, Sociedad Latina as community-based organizations and state organizations. So I can't forget Boston Public Schools, who's an incredibly big partner in this. Slide. So what did we do? We worked with the state and the Puerto Rican community and Puerto Rican organizations to start a fund. The fund was in the range of several $1 million and was able to help with disaster relief efforts both here and in Puerto Rico. We created a resource guide that was particularly focused on helping folks find housing and apply for FEMA benefits. And we created pop-up centers at community-based organizations and existing Boston Public Schools welcome centers. So these pop-up centers were sort of meant to be one-stop shops. And through that, we found that the biggest challenges folks were facing were, one, housing, right? Two, figuring out education for their families, for the children. And three, figuring out workforce development. And four, healthcare. Slide, please. So those are two case examples of how we sort of pulled together in the event of a disaster, right? But there's, as you heard from the first two speakers, there's displaced people worldwide already, right? And so we already have a challenge in terms of logistics. Slide. There are internally displaced people within the United States because of this already, right? So the U.S. is the third most populous country in the world. We have the third most internally displaced people due to natural disasters at 1.44 million in 2018, or just as an example, right? So we already have our own, right? Slide. And we have increasing federal immigration restrictionist policies, right? And this graph is just one of those, right? This is refugee admissions under the Trump administration and the changes since the beginning of the Reagan administration, right? So the annual ceiling, the maximum, is this dark blue line, and the actual number of admitted refugees is this teal line. And in fiscal year 2018, we're talking about 25,000 refugees admitted under the current definition of refugees through the UN Convention of 1951. So this doesn't even consider folks who need to migrate or cross into our borders, through our borders, due to a specific climate change or natural disaster reason. But there's all other sorts of increasing restrictions, right? The attempted end to temporary protected status, the attempt to end DACA, now the implementation of the new public charge rule on being able to get a green card or a visa in the United States. There's all these attempts to actually decrease the number of people, make it more difficult for folks to enter. Slide. And so what are we thinking about for next steps, right? Well, people have been moving in and out of this country and all throughout the world, regardless of what political borders exist. And political borders change, and policies change as to who gets let in, who gets let out, who can leave, right? And so there are still things to do at the global and federal level, even if we might be just thinking about how restrictionist our policies are in the United States in this very moment. Secondly, as someone who works in local government, I'm thinking much more about what are we doing here? How can we be framing things here, be as prepared as we can be here, so that if those things happen at a global or national scale, we are prepared, right? So we have two things. We have a state bill called Resolve House Resolve H149. Boston Initiative. Talk about the Resolve in a second, but the Climate Ready Boston Initiative is looking to help Bostonians, people who live in Boston, prepare for long-term climate change through community empowerment. So they are doing neighborhood-level leadership development, trying to get people who are already engaged to then engage their neighbors, and trying to get people to be as concerned about this issue as they ought to be. So it's a resilience-building strategy. There's a climate explorer. Indeed, you can overlay various types of climate change risks and projected risks at various percentages, and you can overlay that with social factors like English ability in those neighborhoods, or wealth in those neighborhoods, or home ownership in those neighborhoods, or immigration, or not immigration status, but foreign-born or native-born, right, in those neighborhoods. Slide. So finally, we have this state bill, and this state bill came out of our experience of attempting to serve evacuees, mostly from Puerto Rico, but I should also mention a few also from the U.S. Virgin Islands, who again don't have an immigration legal barrier to entering. And that's the lead sponsor, Representative Miranda from Dorchester and Roxbury, and my boss, Yusuf Ivali, testifying as to why we care about this. Because we had to step in as a city government. We can't run away from it. People showed up. We're going to serve those people who show up. So can we study what happened before? Can we study what responses look like elsewhere to create infrastructure that is far more prepared and more responsive next time something like this happens? Because there will be a next time. slide. So I just wanted to thank my interns for helping me pull all of these graphics together and all this research together. And if you want to reach me, email's right up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so before we get started, I want everyone to stand up, take a little break, and just stretch, because we've heard so many great speakers, and then sit back down. Thank you so much for your time. My name is Riddhi Samtani. I'm a recent graduate of Northeastern University, and I'll be talking to you a little bit about what it's like to be from an island nation and what do these topics evoke in me, having the near possibility of being a climate refugee in the near future. So, do you think I can? Thanks. Okay, so this is a little bit about me. I'm from the island of Sint Maarten, which is half French and half Dutch. I've been born and raised there, and my family's been living there for the past 60 years. So my roots are definitely embedded on this island. I worked at the Environmental Protection Agency for one of my co-ops under the Obama administration. I did a little bit of work at the World Bank doing due diligence on energy efficiency projects. And I dabbled a little bit in the private sector doing consulting in sustainability, helping private sectors curb their carbon emissions and look at their carbon footprint, et cetera. And now, as a graduate, I'm looking to see what the future holds. So kind of just recapping what we've learned, right? We've learned what a climate refugee is. We learned that there's a global mass migration on the verge that's happening and is going to increase steadily. We know that 143 million people will be displaced in the near future by climate change. And we know that climate refugees are not protected by any legally binding international laws and experience greater political risk than a lot of other international refugees, which I think you brought a fair point, and like there is value to be placed in considering refugees as a whole concept, but I can't help but be biased because I'm from an island nation. So why is this a problem now? We see that extreme natural hazards create significant challenges for both developed and developing countries. But no group of nations are more vulnerable by climate change than small island nations, and I'll tell you why. So small island developing states is a group of 39 countries and 58 in total, considering territories, of islands that were recognized by the UN in 1992 and represent 2/3 of the countries suffering from the highest relative losses due to natural disasters exacerbated by climate change. And why are SIDS so vulnerable? And this is because of 5 special disadvantages that they face that are out of their control. 1 is their small size, 2, insularity, 3, remoteness, 4, proneness to natural disasters, and 5, environmental fragility. So inherently, we see from this that SIDS are shaped by forces outside of their control. They can't control that they are small. They can't control that they're remote. They can't control that they're insular and completely surrounded by water. And they cannot control the environmental fragility of their ecosystems and of natural organisms that exist there. And so what are the economic vulnerabilities that they face in addition to this? Most of them are one-pillar economies because they can only rely and cannot diversify their economy. So in the case of Sint Maarten is completely reliant on tourism. Without tourism, we don't survive. We don't have crops, and we don't have salt water and salt that we can distribute in large capacities. And so we highly depend on international markets, and that causes a lot of vulnerability in terms of like our economic stability. And then environmental vulnerabilities is that lots of small islands, especially in the Atlantic Ocean, are in equilateral hurricane belt. And in the Pacific Ocean, there are low-lying atolls that are that are made out of coral reefs and are incredibly low-lying, as we saw in the example of Kiribati. And so we know that climbing global temperatures basically threaten the very existence of small islands. And so when I let that sink in for me, my home, where I come from, is threatened completely to be by sea level rise and all these other factors. And so when I think of when that happens, where do I go? Where does my family go for 60 years? Where do my grandparents, my great-grandfather first came there? And so when I think of being a climate refuge, I think it's scary and I think it's terrifying. And a lot of people where I come from don't know how to encompass this idea. They have no idea how to deal with it. And the government, for this reason, reaches this analysis paralysis where they're paralyzed with indecision as to what to do. And so that's why I found the example of Kiribati very, very interesting, because they set forth a model for small islands to combat this idea of a landlessness nation, right? This idea of like what do we do in the case of this event? And I think we all talked about Kiribati a lot, but it's interesting to see how and when an island, hangs on to this idea. How do you run an island that's short on time, short on space, and short on cash in the event of climate change? And I think the predecessor to the current leader of Kiribati, he basically made this decision for the island. And he purchased 6,000 acres of land in Fiji. And so this put forth a model for other small islands to follow. So in investigating that, I found some very interesting ideas and concepts for what post-climate change era looks like for people like myself. And so this is a success story where you see finding camaraderie and unlocking political partnerships in the face of climate change, where you see a successful partnership between Kiribati and Fiji, both recognizing the importance of delivering these partnerships and trying to overcome this battle together. And so this is the first example of a peripheral legal issue with regards to climate change with refugees was ever even explored. And while today, Mamu, or I'm not too sure the correct pronunciation, but the current leader of Kiribati, he invigorates his people to stay on the island and to fight climate change via resiliency mechanisms and the coconut trade and diversifying his economies in many ways. They're two different avenues, right? And so in an attempt to explore this notion further, environmental law scholars have actually begun to discuss this notion of ex situ nationhood, in which governments with some financial support from the international community would continue to represent their populations on an international level at bodies like the United Nations without any connection to their physical territory. So what does this mean? This means that the people of Kiribati would retain their rights as citizens, even whilst being dispersed across the globe. And this notion was kind of put forth by Maxine Burkett from the University of Hawaii. And he did a lot of research in this, and I think this is a very novel idea, right? We understand what modern notion of citizenship means. People who have ties to more than one country, hold different passports. But the notion of that happening without a physical territory is very novel and very new and unexplored. So it begs the question, can Kiribati exist without physical existence of its atoll? And so a citizen from a small island, I wonder, is citizenship something beyond the physical connection to a specific place? Can there even be a Kiribati in the mind of, let's say, Australia and Hawaii? What does assimilation look like, right? And what does cultural conformity look like? And so I think that there's no easy answer to this question. And I think there's no easy solution. And in the case of Kiribati, you see that this is not going to solve the problem. Putting one island into another in the capacity of another island is a temporary shortcut, right? Because even Fiji is not escaping the burdens and the brunt of climate change, because a couple of years ago it was hit by a huge cyclone in one of its main islands and was completely devastated. And so while Kiribati has jumped to push balance on these climate shocks and social harms, this is definitely a warning for other countries as to what they should do, what steps should they be taking in order to prepare their citizens, prepare their cultural identity, and what do they need to do in order to set themselves up so that they don't come to a situation where mass migration happens and their people have nowhere to go. And so what does it mean to be a climate refugee in the midst of a changing climate? And I ask myself this all the time, even though I'm not yet a climate refugee, but it's in my inevitable future. Will I be able to tell my grandparents, and will I be able to tell and show my grandkids where I came from? Is that even a possibility for me? And I don't know, and that terrifies me. And so while there are many things that terrify me, I change my angle and I change my view from an apocalyptic approach to something a little bit more practical. And I think of the understanding we need to have to tackle this issue and to spread awareness and to avoid panic for people and citizens that come from islands. And so in understanding social, economic, and environmental sustainability, understanding that this can be enhanced by disaster risk management and adaptation approaches, right? And a prerequisite for sustainability in small islands in particular is addressing the underlying causes of vulnerability. And in this case, there are many factors that are outside of our control, but understanding that. Then understanding that, it's not, there are practical ways of overcoming this, and progress towards resilient and sustainable development in the context of climate refugees can benefit from questioning assumptions and paradigms to stimulate innovation and to encourage new patterns of response. And in this case, the novel idea that came out of this framework was the ex situ nationhood status. We need more types of frames of mind and thinking in this context when we're dealing with climate change refugees. And finally, successfully addressing disaster risk, climate change, and climate refugees often involves embracing broad participation in strategy development, the capacity to combine multiple perspectives, and contrasting ways of organizing social relations. And so I think this is the framework that I think of when I am discouraged and overwhelmed by what Professor Parekh mentioned as an apocalyptic approach, because I think that causes mainstream panic and is ineffective in solving any problems. And so I think going forward, if we were to adapt our thinking to more open-mindedness frameworks, we could tackle this issue and address it, since it needs to be surfaced as small islands do face a more imminent need for a response in the face of climate change. So thank you.
So let's go. Let's go right to questions or comments. Yes.
What? I just have to wait a minute. I have a question about why you keep using the word neoliberalism. Doesn't China have a lot of pollution that causes global warming issues and other dictatorships? Why are you hanging on the neoliberalism?
Well, the definition of neoliberalism is the promotion of a political agenda that seeks to deregulate industry, promote privatization. And so China's led the world last 20 years in foreign direct investment. And you've seen the relocation of a whole array of dirty industries to China to take advantage of their weaker environmental laws. And there are a lot of Chinese Communist Party officials are getting very wealthy, very rich on, working in business partnerships with transnational capital. So the focus of globalization is really not to promote nationally oriented development models where resources are used to the benefit of local people. Instead, what you're seeing is the imposition of development models where the resources are being appropriated for the benefit of transnational capital and often exported away from those countries. So as a result, living standards are falling in many parts of the world because of the development models that are being implemented, including China, where about, I'm trying to remember the figure, it's about 637 million people live on less than $1 a day in China. So on one level, poverty has increased enormously because the fruits of the economic development in China are not going to the majority of the people. And that's a product of a neoliberal development model.
While we're getting the microphone up there, several of you have worked on the campaigns of contenders for the presidency this year. After we get back into the Paris Accords, what would you say are initial steps that need to be taken to address today?
I have not worked on the campaigns of any presidential candidates yet. I'm available. We need to think as a global community about how to address refugees from climate as well as from other sources. So we tend to take them right now as an ad hoc basis, and each country is sort of setting its own refugee policy. And of course, the UNHCR is working with these countries, but we need a sort of larger umbrella framework that guides countries to deal with refugees in ways that are adequate for countries, but also take seriously the rights and dignities of people who are being made refugees by crises that we play such a large role in contributing to.
Yeah, so 2016, I helped design the environmental justice platform for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, and McKibben and I wrote most of the climate justice platform for him during that time. And I think part of the thinking that we had that moment was that, in contrast to an apocalyptic presentation, it's very difficult to motivate people to take action based solely on fear. It's very easy for people to retreat and withdraw in the face of the magnitude of the climate crisis. So the notion is, how do you inspire people to become involved in a broader movement for climate change? And that is, I think, around a more transformative vision of the way in which climate change could be a catalyst for creating a better society than what we have now. If we look at the way in which climate change could be the foundation for creating a vision of a new society based upon clean production and equity and social justice and green jobs and renewable energy. So it can be inspiring to people and want them to become involved in this movement to make a better world. So I think that's the promise, for example, of a Green New Deal, which really for the first time is gaining traction in the world economy. The Green New Deal could be a foundation for creating a vision for what that better society might look like.
I mean, from my perspective, I'm most concerned about immigrant integration, right? And so we can extend the term immigrant to just newcomer integration. So we're talking about social inclusion and inclusion in other forms for people who have just arrived. Local governments and even regions and states have begun to implement coherent strategies on how to do that, and it's happened in other parts of the world as well. Germany is a good example of that. But for the most part, national governments have not put together plans as such, and so I'd be excited to see the United States put together something like that.
I became a little bit confused about some of the current numbers, particularly in the first two presentations. And I've been thinking about it, and I think that I'm confused along two different dimensions. One is, what do you consider climate change when you're applying it to the numbers? Clearly, you've talked about cyclones, weather and drought, floods. Maybe there's other stuff. Second part I didn't think I understood is the people you applied it to, particularly because we're talking about there might be multiple things, but we were talking about the number of deaths, for example, and where they were, and I didn't get the connection between the deaths and the climate, if you will. So just pick up the numbers currently.
So one way to think about climate change is like a baseball player on steroids. Like one year they might hit 14 home runs for 5 or 6 consecutive years, and then all of a sudden they take steroids and they can hit 35 or 40 home runs. So climate change is like the earth on steroids. So you can't say necessarily that any one natural disaster is a product in and of itself of climate change. But what climate change is doing is making the severity and frequency of natural disasters much more frequent. And so what that means is that climate change is serving more and more as a trigger for major weather events that are impacting peoples throughout the world. But the other point of this is that, and this is really important, is that because of the inequities that are growing in the world economy, more and more people are living in disaster-prone areas where they shouldn't be living. Millions of people have been displaced from their traditional homelands and now live in floodplains or on steep hillsides that are prone to landslides and so forth. So the vulnerability of hundreds of millions of people have increased at the same time the frequency of these climate-related stresses and natural disasters are increasing. This is the first time ever, for example, 2 years ago, we were talking about the Syrian heat waves and the drought that took place there, where the heat index in some communities in Iran reached 165 degrees. So there's been studies that have come out. A lot of scientists are very worried right now because the models are saying that you're going to look at anywhere from 10 to 30, maybe 40% ecosystem collapse if these scenarios play themselves out, which we haven't even really talked about in terms of a climate refugee crisis. But in many ways, that's what was happening in Syria. You're looking at an ecosystem collapse. And the deserts of North Africa are expected to move up into southern Europe, particularly Italy and Greece. So I think the frequency of severe weather stresses, climate-related stresses, are growing, and natural disasters are becoming more frequent. But it's also the fact that more and more people now live in vulnerable areas because of the gross inequities that exist in the world economy, whether it's China or the United States or anywhere else.
So what I heard in your question was a point that I think is really important, which is that it's sometimes hard to understand the different factors that go into making somebody a refugee. And so to what extent is it weather related? To what extent is it climate? To what extent is it mismanagement of resources? To what extent is it political persecution? And sometimes you can't tease them apart sufficiently. So it's a great question. And when I think of climate refugees, I think of course, people who are made refugees directly as a result of climate change. But, in the case of Syria, you have this intensification of weather-related events. If you take something like Sudan or Somalia, you have bad weather conditions that lead to insufficient production of food crops, due in part at least to the mismanagement of resources by a corrupt regime. But all of those circumstances are being intensified by climate. So where you draw the line and say this is because of climate change, or this is because of the mismanagement of resources, or this is because of another factor, I think is really hard. And I think it's important to bear that complexity in mind when we think about climate refugees, because I think there will be a tendency to say, they're not climate refugees, right? They're just fleeing war, and we don't want them. Or they're just fleeing poverty, as Professor Faber mentioned. They're just taking advantage of all the chaos to come to our countries. And poverty and drought, of course, are very much interconnected. If you cross the border because you're fleeing starvation, do you stop them and say, well, let me just make sure you're fleeing famine and not climate-related drought? And of course, we can't do that. It makes no sense to think like that anymore. So I think your question really puts a finger on one of the complexities of talking about climate refugees.
So in closing, let's just take a moment to think about two key factors that have been presented this evening. One is that we're looking at disappearing land masses. And the second is that from a very human perspective, we're looking at the social consequences of those disappearing land masses and rising populations as they relate to water use and agriculture and how we feed folks and how refugees are moved around and how they're treated, both in relation to the places they've left, identity, and in relation to the places that they're moving to. That is, are they assimilated or are they somehow dispersed in ways that are negative to the identities that they've developed? We'll be back in this space as a somewhat identifiable group in the next 2 weeks, and I encourage you all to get out and vote next Tuesday. And also stay in touch with the news. Let me just note in passing that there was a memo sent to all of us on this campus about the virus and its likely spread, and we're going to have a number of folks who will be traveling to a variety of places around the world over the course of the next week and then returning, and that may also have some impacts on us as a class group. So for the students who won't be here next week, we hope that you get a chance to enjoy and work on whatever it is that you may be working on. And for everyone else, we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot. And thanks to our speakers.
I just felt a little bit. I was just like trying to go. Yeah, I was cutting out stuff just because it was just yeah. So I was,
No, no,